over the Solomon Sea. In the bright mornings of 1943, Japanese pilots came to dread a particular noise, a thin, rising whistle that slid down out of the sun a half-second ahead of anything they could see. It was not the engine. It was the air itself, splitting as it forced its way through the oil cooler intakes set into the roots of a strange bent wing. By the time a man heard it clearly, the thing was already on him, already firing, already past. The Americans would later claim that the Japanese had named the aircraft for that sound, and the name they reported back was a grim one, Whistling Death. The men who flew the Mitsubishi Zero, the most feared dogfighter in the Pacific. We're about to learn what those words actually meant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button, and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Here is the part the legend usually leaves out. The aircraft that earned that terrible name had very nearly never reached the war at all. The United States Navy, the service that paid for it, had looked at it, flown it, and decided it could not safely land on the deck of a carrier. Test pilots were killed trying. Young aviators came to fear the landing more than they feared the enemy. For a time, the most advanced fighter in the American inventory was treated as a problem to be solved rather than a weapon to be used, handed off to Marines to fly from dirt and crush coral, because nobody could make it behave at sea. And when it finally did reach combat, its first real battle was not a victory. It was a beating, and the men taking the beating were American. So this is not a story about a wonder weapon that swept the sky clean the moment it appeared. The truth is stranger than that, and harder. It is a story of a flawed, difficult, half-rejected machine that, placed in the right hands and turned loose against an enemy who had quietly lost the ability to replace his own dead, became one of the deadliest aircraft of the entire war. And it is the story of the men at both ends of that whistle, the ones who flew it and the ones who heard it coming. Two of those men were born in the same year, on opposite sides of the ocean, and their lives rhyme in ways neither of them would ever know. The first was born on the 15th of June, 1916, in Karafuto, the cold Japanese half of the island of Sakhalin, about as far north as the empire reached. His name was Tetsuzo Iwamoto. His father was a policeman who rose to become a local official. And when the family moved south to Hokkaido, the boy grew up in deep snow and learned to ski before he learned much of anything about the wider world. Later, the family moved again to the small town of Masuda, where his parents gave up their old life and took up farming. He was the third of 3 sons. He was quiet, exact, stubborn in a way that did not always announce itself. In 1934, at 18, he left the farm and joined the Imperial Japanese Navy. He did not enter as an officer. He had neither the money nor the connections for that road. He came in at the bottom, and in December of 1936, he finished pilot training and earned the right to fly. By early 1938, he was over China, and there, his first real combat, he began to kill, and he was good at it immediately. He did not fly the way the romantic picture of the Japanese suggested, all swirling turns and single combat for honor. He preferred a fast diving pass, one brutal slash from high above, and then altitude again before the enemy could gather himself to answer. It was cold arithmetic dressed up as flying, and it kept him alive while flashier men burned. He kept a diary through all of it, page after page, year upon year, a private record in his own hand that no one would read until long after he was gone. The second man was born 5 months later, on the 24th of November, 1916, in Brooklyn, New York. His name was Kenneth Walsh. He came from no money either. In December 1933, at 17 years old, he walked into a recruiting office and joined the United States Marine Corps as a private. They made him an aircraft mechanic and a radio man. And for a while, that was the whole of it. A young man with grease worked into his knuckles fixing other men's airplanes. But Walsh wanted to be in the air, not beneath it. In 1936, he was selected for flight training, and in the spring of 1937, he won his wings, not as an officer, but as an enlisted naval aviation pilot, one of the uncommon sergeants who flew. He spent the next years on the decks of 3 different carriers, climbing the enlisted ranks one rung at a time, rising to master technical sergeant and then to marine gunner, until at last, in October 1942, the Corps made him officer. Consider that symmetry for a moment. 2 boys off a farm and out of a city tenement, born the same year, who joined their navies as ordinary enlisted men in the same winter, who earned their wings within months of one another, and who would each become an ace flying the most celebrated single-engine fighter his country built. The war would eventually put them under the same sky. It would let one of them live to be an old man and bury the other before 40, though not in the way anyone watching in 1943 could have guessed. To understand why the men who heard that whistle were so badly shaken by it, you first have to understand how completely they had been winning before it came. For the first year and a half of the Pacific War, the Zero had been very nearly untouchable, and every pilot who flew it knew the feeling. It was the lightest, most agile fighter in the sky, able to turn inside anything the Allies put up against it, and to fly distances that seemed to defy belief. Its designers had achieved this through a single ruthless idea. They stripped the aircraft of everything that did not help it turn and climb and reach. There was no armor plate behind the pilot to stop a bullet. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks to keep a hit from becoming a fire. The radio was so poor that many pilots tore out to save the weight. Every pound was sacrificed performance, and the result was a machine that floated through a dogfight like something alive. It weighed barely half what the American fighter coming to meet it would weigh. In the hands of a man like Iwamoto, it had no equal in a turning fight, and the men who flew it had built their entire understanding of air combat on that fact. They were, in the most literal sense, artists of the individual duel. Their training, when there had still been time and fuel for proper training, ran for years and demanded a level of skill that washed out all but a handful of candidates. They thought of themselves as the inheritors of an older warrior tradition, men for whom the single combat, pilot against pilot, was the truest test of worth. For a year and a half that philosophy had carried all before it, and it had blinded them to a question that would soon become a matter of life and death. What happens to the artist of the duel when the enemy refuses to duel at all? The answer was being built in a factory in Connecticut. The aircraft was a chance-bought F-4U Corsair, and almost everything about it was the opposite of the Zero. Where the Japanese had subtracted, the Americans had added. They started with an engine of brutal size, a Pratt & Whitney double Wasp turning out 2,000 horsepower, roughly twice what the Zero's engine produced, and they built an airframe to carry it that was heavy, strong, and unapologetic. The propeller needed to convert all that power was enormous, well over 13 feet across, and that single fact drove the design's most famous feature: to give the giant blade enough clearance off the ground without making the landing gear absurdly tall and fragile. The engineers bent the wing downward where it left the fuselage, and then back up again, the inverted gull shape that made the Corsair impossible to mistake for anything else in the sky. As a bonus, the wing now met the body at close to a right angle, which cut drag. The shape was not decoration. It was a solution to a problem of physics, and it gave the aircraft its strange, hunched, predatory silhouette. Into that airframe, the Americans poured everything the Zero had left out: armor plate to shield the pilot, self-sealing tanks that could take a bullet and keep flying, 650 caliber Browning machine guns buried in the wings, a weight of fire that could tear an unarmored aircraft apart in a single short burst, a real radio, heavy, reliable flight instruments. The Corsair was the first American single-engine fighter to fly faster than 400 miles an hour in level flight, and it could dive faster than that and climb like nothing its weight had any right to. It gave up the close, slow, turning fight to Zero and asked a different question entirely. Why turn with him at all when you can come down on him from above at a speed he cannot match, fire, and be gone before he can bring his guns to bear? But all of that power and weight came with a price, and the price was nearly fatal to the whole program. The Corsair was a beast of land on a carrier. The long nose that housed a great engine blocked the pilot's view straight ahead exactly when he needed it most. On the final approach to a moving deck, the aircraft had a habit of bouncing hard on touchdown. Worst of all, near the stall the left wing would suddenly drop without warning, a vicious flick that could roll the aircraft into the sea or into the island of the ship in the last seconds of a landing. Men died discovering these traits. The Navy, which had ordered the thing to fly from its carriers, took one hard look at the accident reports and pulled it from carrier duty. The aircraft acquired an ugly reputation among the young officers who had to fly it, a reputation captured in a grim nickname that suggested it killed its own more reliably than it killed the enemy. So the Navy gave its newest and most powerful fighter to the United States Marine Corps to fly from land bases in the Solomon Islands out of the mud and the pierced steel and the crushed coral, where at least there was no pitching deck to find at the end of every flight. It would take the British, of all people, to show how to tame it on a carrier. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm worked out a long, curving approach that kept the deck in the pilot's eye, sliding around a blind spot of that long nose until the final instant. And with that single change of technique, they were operating Corsairs from carriers before the United States Navy managed it. The machine had not changed. The way men flew it had. And so the Corsair came to war not as a conquering hero, but as a difficult, dangerous, half-trusted tool in the hands of Marine pilots who were still learning what it could and could not do. Its combat debut announced none of the glory that would later attach to its name. A dozen Corsairs of Marine Fighting Squadron 124, the first operational Marine squadron to fly the type, reached Guadalcanal in the second week of February 1943. Kenneth Walsh was among them, an old enlisted hand turned new lieutenant, flying a fighter that even its own service had nearly given up on. On the 14th of February, the squadron flew one of its first real missions, escorting a formation of heavy bombers in a daylight raid against a Japanese airfield at the southern end of Bougainville. The Zeros came up to meet them, flown by exactly the kind of experienced pilots the Solomon still held in early 1943, and what followed was not a demonstration of American superiority. It was a rout. The escort was carved up. By the end of it, the Americans had lost one type of fighter, two of another, two of the new Corsairs, and two of the bombers they had been sent to protect. And against all that loss, they could credit the Japanese with perhaps a single aircraft destroyed, and even that one to a collision rather than the guns. The men who survived it called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and it was sobering enough that further daylight missions in that direction were called off until the Americans could work out better tactics. The whistling death had arrived over the Pacific, and on its first real day of work it had been the one to bleed. This is a truth the highlight reel skipped past. The aircraft that would end the war with one of the finest kill records of any fighter on any side began its combat life on the losing end of a one-sided fight, flown by men who had not yet learned its secrets, against an enemy still near the peak of his skill. Greatness, when it came, would not come from the machine alone. It would come from what the men learned to do with it, and from a change in the enemy that had nothing to do with the Corsair at all. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Because while the Americans were learning, the Japanese were quietly running out of the one thing no factory could produce on a schedule. They were running out of men like Iwamoto. In November 1943, after the better part of 2 years that had taken him from the carrier decks of the Pearl Harbor strike to the long, fever-soaked sorties of the South Pacific, Tetsuzo Iwamoto was sent to Rabaul, the great Japanese bastion on the island of New Britain, and assigned to a fighter group thrown into the daily grind of defending it. He arrived as one of the most experienced pilots left in the Imperial Navy, a veteran of China and of the early carrier battles, a man who had survived long enough to become rare. And around him, he found something that must have chilled him more than any enemy aircraft. He found boys. The squadrons were filling now with pilots who had a fraction of the training he had received, sent forward because the front was hungry for replacements and there was no longer the fuel or the time to teach them properly. He was a master craftsman, and he had been handed apprentices and told to hold a fortress with them. For the next 3 months over Rabaul, Iwamoto fought nearly every day. He led his young pilots up against the rising tide of American air power, and he flew the way he had always flown, the fast diving pass out of the high sun, the single slash, the climb away. He claimed enemy after enemy in those months, a tally so large that historians still argue over it, because the Japanese counted victories differently than the Americans did and credited them loosely, and because so many records were later lost. By his own account, the numbers were enormous. The honest truth is that no one will ever know the real figure, and that the real figure, whatever it was, did not matter. Because for every aircraft Iwamoto and a handful of veterans like him could knock down, the Americans sent more. And the Americans, crucially, were getting their own shot-down pilots back, fishing them out of the water, patching them up, returning them to the fight with another month of hard-won experience, while every Japanese veteran lost was a candle blown out for good, his skill and his knowledge gone with him into the sea. This was the real collision, and it had very little to do with turning circles or top speeds. On one side stood a system that protected its men, armored their cockpits, sealed their fuel tanks, pulled them from the ocean, and trained their replacements without stint. On the other stood a culture that built itself around the individual warrior and the beauty of the single duel, and that was now feeding its irreplaceable masters and its barely trained children into the same fire at the same rate. As if courage alone could make up the difference. Iwamoto, marking his kills on the side of the zero, sat at the exact point where those two worlds met. He decorated his aircraft not with the usual stark tally marks, but with small painted cherry blossoms, one petal for each victim, a soldier's flower blooming down the side of a machine that was running out of time. He was, by any fair reckoning, one of the greatest fighter pilots his nation ever produced. And he was losing, a little more each day, to an enemy who had decided that the way to win was not to produce greater warriors, but to make the warrior matter less. The whistle was coming down out of the sun more often now, and the men who heard it were beginning to understand that everything they believed about the sky, everything that had made them invincible for a year and a half, had quietly stopped being true. The change had a shape, and the shape was a pair of aircraft flying together. The first thing the Americans learned after the beating they took in February was to stop fighting the Zero's fight. A corsair that tried to turn with a Zero would lose, and the loss was usually paid in a man's life. So the Marines set aside the old instinct to mix it up in a turning duel and put something colder in its place. They called it energy. Altitude was energy a pilot could spend. Speed was energy he could store. The corsair had far more of both than any Zero, and the whole art of the thing was never to give that advantage away. You climbed above the enemy and you stayed there. You waited. When the moment came, you rolled over and dove, gathering speed the Zero could not hope to match, fired one short hammering burst as you flashed past, and then used every bit of that speed to climb back up to where you had started, above him, untouchable, ready to come down again. The Zero pilot, who had given years of his life to perfecting the turn, would wrench his aircraft around to meet you and find nothing waiting there but empty sky and the sight of you already climbing away. He could not follow you up. He could not catch you going down. He could only wait for you to fall on him again and pray he saw it coming. The second thing they learned was never to fly alone. The Americans flew in pairs, a leader and a wingman, two aircraft guarding each other the way two men might stand back to back in a crowd. If a Zero fastened itself to one of them, the pair would turn toward one another in a weaving cross, and a hunted corsair would draw the Zero straight across the guns of his partner. An officer named Thatch had worked the idea out earlier in the war, and by 1943 it had set into hard doctrine across the whole American fighter arm. It asked a pilot to surrender the thing the Japanese prized most, the personal kill chase to its finish, the lone hunter's glory. It asked him instead to break off a sure victory in order to cover a friend, to fight as one moving part of a larger machine rather than as a single swordsman. And the Japanese, still flying as individuals in search of single combat, kept offering themselves up one at a time to an enemy who never once came to them one at a time. Behind all of it stood the thing the Japanese could see the least and had the most reason to fear, because it could not be fought directly at all. The Americans had radar, and they had men whose entire purpose was to read those glowing screens and send the fighters to precisely the right place at precisely the right height before the enemy ever arrived. A Japanese formation that believed it was slipping in unnoticed would climb instead into a sky already stacked with corsairs, waiting above with the sun at their backs. Surprise, height, the first shot, all of it had quietly changed owners. A great pilot in a beautiful and agile aircraft was being beaten before he could even locate a man to fight, beaten by an enemy who had turned air combat from a contest of warriors into something arranged in advance and carried out with terrible efficiency. That was what the whistle truly carried down out of the sun. It was the sound of the system arriving, and against the system, courage alone had nothing to bargain with. Kenneth Walsh was the man who showed what that system could do once a pilot of real skill sat inside it. He scored his first victories on 1st of April, 1943. Over the Russell Islands, 2 Zeros and a dive bomber knocked down in a single fight while he helped cover a flight of twin-tailed Army fighters. 6 weeks later, on the 13th of May, he caught 3 more Zeros and became the first man ever to make ace in a Corsair, the first to reach 5 kills in the difficult, half-trusted machine the Navy had cast off. The promotion to first lieutenant came at the end of the month. Through June, he added another Zero and an enemy float plane over Bougainville. He was learning the aircraft the way only combat teaches it, finding the edges of what it could do, and it was carrying him through fights that killed other men. Then came August, and August nearly killed him twice. On the 12th, he was escorting heavy bombers when a swarm of Zeros fell on the formation over Choiseul. In the wild fight that followed, he claimed 2 of them, though the honest record afterward suggested the Japanese had actually lost only 1, the kind of gap between claim and truth that ran through every air force in that war on every side, because men firing and dying at 400 miles an hour are poor witnesses to what they have done. A Zero shot his hydraulics to pieces, and he had to bring the Corsair in fast and flat with no flaps and no working gear, sliding onto a forward strip and plowing into another parked Corsair to stop. He walked away from the wreck. 3 days later, on the 15th, he proved why his name would be remembered. Over Vella La Vella, with the enemy bent on bombing American troops and shipping below, Walsh threw a small division of fighters straight into a Japanese formation that outnumbered them 6-1. He dove into it again and again, taking hit after hit, and when he climbed out of chaos, he had personally shot down 2 dive bombers and a fighter, and the bombing had been broken up. But it was the 30th of August that became the heart of the citation. His engine began to fail on the way to the fight, and rather than turn for home, he put down at the forward field at Munda, abandoned the sick aircraft, climbed into another Corsair that happened to be there, and took off alone to catch up with his squadron. He found them. He also found roughly 50 Japanese fighters, and he was by himself. A reasonable man would have hung back at the edge and waited. Walsh attacked, alone, into 50. He tore in firing and brought down 4 of them before the cannon fire. The others finally shredded his aircraft and killed the engine. He glided the dying Corsair down toward the water off Vella La Vella and ditched it in the sea, and a rescue boat pulled him out alive. By the end of that month, he had 20 victories, and for the 2 fights on the 15th and the 30th, for diving alone and outnumbered into the enemy to protect the men below, he would be given the Medal of Honor. He was not, by his own telling, anything more than a working pilot who had learned his trade. He had come up from the enlisted ranks, an old mechanic who knew the machine from the inside out. And perhaps that was part of it. He flew the Corsair the way a man flies something he understands completely, asking it for exactly what it could give and never for what it could not. The difference between him and Iwamoto was not skill. Both men had that in abundance. The difference was the world each of them flew inside. When Walsh went into the sea, his country fished him out and gave him another aircraft and another chance. When a man like Iwamoto was finally lost, there would be no one as quality to take his place. And over about that autumn and winter, the men of Iwamoto's quality were being used up at last. The Americans came to the great fortress without pause now, in raid after raid, and among the squadrons grinding it down was one whose name became a legend of its own, a Marine outfit flying Corsairs under a hard-living, hard-drinking commander named Gregory Boyington. His pilots called themselves the Black Sheep, and in roughly 12 weeks of fighting in the Solomons, they claimed something near 94 enemy aircraft destroyed. They flew into the same airspace Iwamoto was defending, the long contested corridor the Americans nicknamed the Slot, and the 2 sides bled each other through the closing months of 1943. The fighting spared no one's legend. On the 3rd of January, 1944, Boynton himself, the most famous Marine fighter pilot of the war, was shot down over Rabaul and vanished. His own country wrote him off as dead. In truth, he had been pulled from the water by a Japanese submarine and would spend the rest of the war in a prison camp, a fact no one back home would learn until the very end. The whistling death took American lives as readily as it took Japanese ones. It simply took fewer of them, and that was the whole story of the war in a single sentence. By February of 1944, the position at Rabaul had become untenable for Japanese air power, and the Imperial Navy pulled its surviving aircraft back, abandoning the great base to wither under the bombs. Iwamoto flew out with what was left. He had marked a staggering number of claimed victories in those 3 months, a figure historians still treat with caution. And it did not matter, because the thing he'd been sent a hole was lost anyway, ground down not by braver men, but by more of them, backed by radar and rescue boats and a factory line that never stopped. He went on a truck, and then to Formosa and the Philippines, and was at last commissioned an officer in October 1944. The rank arriving almost as an afterthought to a man who had been flying and killing since before some of his own pilots could read. In the final spring, he was over Okinawa, flying the great waves of attacks the Japanese threw at the American fleet. And then he was back in the home islands, where the Empire had returned to doing what it had done at the start of his career. It was training boys, sending them up barely able to fly, and burying them. Iwamoto, one of the last great craftsmen left, spent the end of the war trying to teach children enough to survive a sky that no longer had any mercy in it. He survived. That was the strange thing. One of the finest fighter pilots the Imperial Navy ever produced lived through every campaign that killed his contemporaries, through China and Coral Sea and the long ordeal of Rabaul, and the slaughter off Okinawa, and walked out the other side of the war alive. Kenneth Walsh survived it too. He had gone home in the autumn of 1943, and on the 8th of February, 1944, the President of the United States pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest in the White House. He came back to the war in the spring of 1945 with a new squadron and a newer model of the same Corsair, flying once more over the Philippines and Okinawa, and on the 22nd of June, 1945, he shot down his 21st and final enemy aircraft, a Zero flown as a suicide weapon, one of the very kamikazes that men like Iwamoto were now escorting to their deaths. Two pilots who had risen from nothing in the same winter, who had each mastered the great fighter of their nation, both came through the fire. And there the two stories, which had run so closely parallel for so long, finally broke apart, because the peace was kinder to one of them than it was to the other. Walsh stayed in the Marine Corps. He flew transport missions in the Korean War, rose to lieutenant colonel, and in January of 1959, in one of those quiet turns that history hands out without comment, he was posted to Japan, sent to serve in the country he had spent his youth fighting, as a maintenance officer caring for the aircraft of a peacetime air wing. The old mechanic finished his career the way he had begun it, looking after airplanes. He lived a long life. He died on the 30th of July, 1998, at 81 years old, and they buried him at Arlington with the honors his nation reserves for its bravest. Iwamoto was not given any of that. When Japan surrendered, the Navy he had served all his adult life simply ceased to exist, and the country he had defended turned its face away from the men who had fought for it. In the bitterness of defeat and occupation, a new mood took hold, and former warriors like Iwamoto found themselves treated not as heroes, but as relics of a militarism the nation now wished to forget. There was a radio program that branded such men the willing tools of the war makers. There was no work for a fighter ace. He drank. He sank into a depression he could not climb out of. He took whatever labor he could find to feed his family: civil engineering, farming, raising poultry, even running a small snack bar. The greatest naval aviator of the Pacific, reduced to scraping out a living in a country that no longer wanted to remember what he had been. And yet the man underneath the legend was still there. When a neighbor died of tuberculosis and the frightened townspeople would not go near the body for fear of catching it, Iwamoto stuffed cotton into his own nose, walked in alone, and prayed over the man and buried him himself. He made toys by hand for his two small children. He was waiting, the way he had always waited, for the moment to come around again. It never did. Only after the occupation ended and the country began to right itself did he finally find steady work, in a textile mill in 1952. The following summer, he began to suffer pain in his stomach. The doctors misjudged it, operated again, and then, for reasons that were never made clear, removed 3 or 4 of his ribs without putting him under. The wound turned septic. He weakened to the spring of 1955, and on the 20th of May he died at 38 years old, leaving 2 young children behind. His wife remembered his last words. He told her that when he got well, he wanted to fly again. He had outlived the war by 10 years, and the war had killed him anyway. It simply took its time. The man who could fly and fight and land in pitch darkness without a single instrument to guide him but the ones in his own hands. The man who had survived being hunted across half the Pacific by the deadliest aircraft America ever sent against him, died in a hospital bed because of an operation gone wrong, in a country too poor and too broken to have given him anything better. His diaries, the careful private record he had kept across all those years of war, were found by his family long after, in the 1970s, and published so that the world could finally read what one of its great pilots had seen. Most people had never heard his name. They still have not. So return at the end to that sound, The whistle out of the sun, the thin rising shriek that made experienced men flinch before they could even see what was coming for them. It was easy afterward to tell the story as a simple one, the tale of the magnificent machine that frightened the enemy and won the sky. The Corsair was magnificent in its way. It finished the war with one of the finest records of any fighter on any side. It stayed in production longer than any other piston engine fighter the Americans ever built, and it went on fighting in another war after this one was over. All of that is true, but it is not what the men at both ends of that whistle would tell you the story was about. What the Japanese aces saw in the moment they first understood that aircraft was not really a better airplane. The Zero could still outturn it any day of the week. What they saw was the end of a whole way of thinking about war and about themselves. They had built everything, their training, their tactics, their pride, on the warrior as an individual, the single-skilled man whose courage and artistry could tip a battle. And they were being beaten, steadily and without drama, by an enemy who had decided that the individual warrior was not the point. The Americans protected their pilots, armored them, pulled them from the sea, trained their replacements without end, and sent them up in disciplined pairs guided by men reading machines on the ground. Skill still mattered, and Kenneth Walsh proved how much. But skill now flew inside a system, and the system was what won. The deepest truth in it is the one written in the two lives that ran side by side through this whole account, and then diverged at the finish. Two men born the same year, who came up the same hard way and reached the same rare heights, and who both survived the worst the war could do. One went home to a country that remembered him, honored him, and let him grow old. The other went home to a country that had forgotten him before he was even gone, and he died young and unwanted with the words of a pilot still on his lips. The Corsair did not make that difference. The whistle did not make that difference. What made the difference was that on one side of that ocean, a man was treated as something worth keeping, in war and in the peace that followed, and on the other side, he was treated as something to be spent and then set aside. That, far more than any wing or any engine, was a thing the Japanese aces glimpsed when they first heard death whistling down out of the sun. It was the future arriving, and it had no place in it for the lone warrior, however brave, however gifted, however willing to DITO stand at one of those forward airfields in the closing months of 1943, was to understand that the air war over the Solomons had become a kind of factory in its own right, grinding through men and machines on a daily schedule. The long blue corridor of water running up the island chain, the gauntlet the Americans called a slot, carried wave after wave of aircraft north toward the great Japanese fortress at Rabaul, and the distances were punishing. A pilot might spend the better part of days strapped into a cockpit, soaked through his flight suit in the tropical heat, fighting for 10 violent minutes somewhere over New Britain, and then turning for the long run home across open sea with his fuel gauge falling and his hands cramping on the stick. The mud worked its way into everything. The salt air chewed at the aluminum. Mechanics labored through the night by lantern light to keep enough aircraft flyable for the next dawn, and the men who climbed into them did, so knowing the plain arithmetic of it, that some of them would not be coming back. Submarines and flying boats waited along the routes to pull the downed airmen out of swells, and a man in the water off the slot had a real chance of being lifted out and flown back to fight again, a small mercy his enemy could not count on. Into that grind the Americans fed more than the Marines alone. The United States Navy had its own Corsair squadron to fight, and its story sharpened the irony of the whole aircraft to a point. Fighting Squadron 17, formed at the start of 1943 under a hard-driving commander named Tom Blackburn, had been among the first Navy units to receive the Corsair, and they had trained for the very thing the Navy had supposedly abandoned, flying the bent winged fighter from the deck of a carrier. They were good at it. Then, on the verge of deployment, the Navy chose to standardize its carrier squadrons on the Hellcat instead, and Blackburn's men were put ashore, sent to fly from a strip in the New Georgia Islands like the Marines they had expected to outrank at sea. They took the slight and made it a legend. They called themselves the Jolly Rogers, painted a skull and crossbones on their cowlings, and in roughly 2.5 months of fighting, they shot down on order 150 enemy aircraft, the highest tally of any Corsair squadron in the Pacific, and turned out more aces than any other naval unit then in combat. When the great carrier strikes against Rabaul came in November, it was these land-based Corsairs that flew protective cover over the fleet, and then dropped onto the carrier decks to refuel between patrols. their commander noting with dry satisfaction that the landings he was now making proved to every doubter the aircraft had been fit for carriers all along. The machine the Navy had cast off was killing for Navy from the land and landing on its carriers between kills, as if to make the point twice. The deadly habit that had exiled the Corsair in the first place did not survive contact with the men who flew it either. That vicious drop of the left wing near the stall, the trait that had killed young pilots in the landing pattern, was not solved in a laboratory by the engineers who had drawn the aircraft. It was solved in the field. A pilot in Blackburn's own squadron worked out that a small strip of metal fixed to the leading edge of the right wing, a little spoiler no larger than a man's hand, would make both wings give up their lift at the same instant rather than one letting go before the other. The fix was crude and cheap and final. It turned a treacherous stall into an honest one a pilot could feel arriving, and it went straight onto production line. The fighter the Navy had nearly discarded was being perfected, one hard-won lesson at a time, by the men whose lives hung on getting it right. Behind those men stood the one thing the Japanese could never answer, and it was neither courage nor skill. It was sheer volume. The Corsair was not built in a single factory, but in three, by Vought, who had designed it, and by Goodyear and Brewster under license, and the lines kept running long after the war that made the aircraft famous was over. More than 12,000 of them were built across a production run of better than a decade, the longest of any American piston engine fighter ever made. The final examples handed to a foreign Navy years after the men who first flew it over the Solomons had gone home and grown older. Set that against the reality on the far side of the slot, where Japan had grown so short of aviation fuel that it could no longer spare enough of it to properly train the pilots it so badly needed, and the shape of the defeat comes into focus. It was never truly a duel between two aircraft. It was a collision between two ideas of how a nation makes war, and only one of those ideas had factories standing behind it that did not stop. That was the truth waiting at the far end of the whistle, and it had nothing to do with bravery. A pilot could be the finest man in the sky on a given morning, and it changed nothing about the slow mathematics closing in around him. The aircraft would keep coming, in greater numbers each month, flown by men who were fished from the sea when they fell and replaced by fresh ones when they died, built by the thousand and improved by the people who flew them. What the men in the Zeros faced was not a better warrior. It was a way of waging war in which the lone warrior had quietly stopped being the thing that decided the outcome. How much a single great pilot could still achieve inside such a machine, and how little in the end it would matter, was about to be written by two of them, one in a Corsair over Solomons and one in a Zero over Rabaul. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.